Hello and welcome. In tonight's video, I'm going to be cooking Miles Davis Southside Chicago Chili Mac. The great jazz trumpeter, just revolutionary artist, incredible body of work from Miles Davis, but apparently he taught himself to cook as well. And this is one of his recipes. He never released it, but his wife put it out after his death. And I'm not so foolish as to make a chili on this channel. I know people get very violent about what chili is. He calls this a chili mac, and that is how I would describe it. A kind of chili-inflected meat sauce served over pasta, like a Cincinnati chili, which kind of came from a Greek immigrant adding Middle Eastern spices to a typical beef stew. Originally served over hot dogs, later over pasta, usually with raw onion on top, which we're not going to do. But it's a chili mac, so I just want to set expectations. We're not going to be slow roasting a shoulder with guajillo peppers or something. And this is of historical interest, and it's also a very accessible recipe. We're using some canned ingredients, some dried spices, and then a pound of ground beef and a pound of ground pork. His recipe calls for the pound of ground beef, half a pound of ground pork, and half a pound of ground veal. I'm not going to buy the veal for this, so just fine to use some pork. I am going to try to stick to his recipe, as I know that's annoying if you depart when you're trying to make something like this, so as best as I can, I will do so. The flavor comes from chili powder, garlic powder, and cumin. To start off with, we're going to season the meat. When I make a chili in this form, chili mac, typically I'm adding these spices after we cook the meat, but according to the recipe, we're going to start off by adding a couple teaspoons to the ground beef. And then we're going to add a teaspoon of chili powder to go along with it. Nothing fancy here. Just a typical blended chili powder. Could of course use whatever one you favor. And then we'll finish things off with a teaspoon of cumin. We'll get that added here. And we also want to add some salt and pepper. He does not provide measurements for salt and pepper in this recipe, so I'm just going to add some. We'll do it by eye, and then, of course, as the dish progresses, we'll keep an eye on the seasonings as we taste everything. So nice grind of black pepper here as well. And then we're going to go ahead and mix this all together before we cook it in our pot. And I find the easiest way for something like this is just to use your hands. Trying to do a spoon for something like this, definitely more of a challenge. So I'm just going to use my hands to get that all incorporated, kind of, roughly evenly mixed in here without kneading the heck out of this meat dough. Alright, just want to get that incorporated. There we go. Wash my hands and we can continue. Okay, so we'll set our meat aside, and then we've got some kidney beans here. Just gonna open up these cans. I did not intentionally buy low sodium kidney beans. Noticing that for the first time while doing this. Not that it matters, right? It just actually works for us to control the salt levels to where we want. And that's what we're going to be doing once I get these kidney beans opened up. We're going to drain off the liquid. Then I'm going to add them to my bowl here because we're going to season these. Again, it's just going to be a bit of salt and pepper. No measurements provided from Miles Davis for this part, but we'll get some seasoning in there. I actually like that he's seasoning these different components. You want to make sure you get a nice flavor throughout the dish, and the salt and pepper are going to support that. So that's all we need to do. Get a little salt and pepper. We'll just mix this up. And then this will set aside once we are ready to add it to our pot. Alright, overall prep for this recipe is quite simple. We have the meat and the kidney beans, and then we just have this white onion that we're going to chop up. I'm guessing you probably used white onion, yellow onion, just fine. Sure, you could use red onion. First things first, we'll cook this in oil in the pot, and then we'll add the beef. But let's go ahead and get our onion peeled here. Gonna slice off the tip of the root end there, and then just a bit of the top. Get us in a position to chop the onion. Gonna do a cut in half. Get a little easier to get that peel off there. Go ahead and peel that off. There we go. And peel this other half. That half very cooperative, just came right off there. And then let's go ahead and start chopping these. I'm not going to go super fine on this chop. They'll cook down a little bit, and they'll just give a little texture in the sauce too. So cut through there, and then same on this other half. Gonna go ahead and cut down through. Giving myself segments for the chop, and a horizontal cut there into the middle. And let's go ahead and chop these. Last little bit off the stem end there so we don't waste. Get these into a bowl to get them out of our way. Using the small cutting board today, so not a lot of real estate. Alright. Go ahead and chop up this other half here. Pretty simple work. Like I said, this is a pretty accessible recipe. No fancy techniques. Everyday, readily available ingredients. But it's gonna make a nice, hearty chili mac. Pretty easy to put together and make for a nice meal. Okay, one last thing that we need is a can of beef broth. Gonna get that opened up here. The recipe calls for 1 can of beef consomme, so I'm interpreting that as beef stock. Just don't really find consomme at the store these days. Obviously, you could make one. You could make a homemade beef stock. It's going to make this even better. Obviously, we don't all necessarily have the time to do that. Okay, so we're going to be making Miles Davis's recipe for Southside chili mac. So it would seem appropriate to listen to some Miles Davis music while we do so, connect with the spirit of this incredible musician. I'm not going to have the music in the video, of course, so I won't disturb your sleep potentially, and because it would run afoul of YouTube. I actually have filmed a couple of jazz-oriented videos that I have not released because even non-monetized there are a bunch of issues, so maybe we'll figure out some way to put those out at some point. But in the spirit of being chill and relaxing though, I would choose In a Silent Way. This is an incredible recording. It's long form. It's just basically 2 tracks, one on each side of a vinyl back in the day. And it has jazzy bits, but overall it has just a kind of very chill, relaxing vibe, which I think is great. So let's open up our CD player here. And we will put in the disc. There we go. And we would hit play if you're feeling it. The beautiful thing about physical media, of course, is having liner notes. We won't go through everything here. Miles the dresser, Miles the boxer, Miles the bon vivant, Miles the pioneer. And in today's video, we're looking at Miles the cook. Just unbelievable body of work. Let's see, those quiet vibes here with the lead off in the notes. In a Silent Way is about quietude, about the sounds of silence, the paradox that was so much a part of Miles Davis' art, the space he created around his horn, and with few exceptions, around the music of those who played with him. It really speaks to the qualities of this recording. Really beautiful. Check it out if you have any interest, and let's get back to our cooking. Okay, so let's get the stove fired up. Now we're cooking with gas. Gonna get some vegetable oil into the bottom of the pot here. Now, this is where I had to make a deviation from his recipe, and it might actually be a notable one. So in his recipe, he calls for basically melting some beef suet in your pot and having a 1-inch depth of that melted fat in the bottom of your pot. Now that is a tremendous amount of fat. You really be like deep frying your onions and beef. That seems like a lot. Of course, beef suet is going to bring flavor, but that seems to make for a really greasy dish. That being said, I was going to go with beef suet, but I could not find any at the market when I was shopping, so I'm going to go with vegetable oil. Obviously, most of you are going to have that. So I did have to kind of step away from the recipe at this juncture. And like I said, that beef fat definitely will affect the flavor, but I think this will still be tasty. But we're just going to start with getting our onions in here, and we'll kind of get them softened up before we add the beef. If you've been watching the channel, you'll notice we have a different setup here. Go ahead and get these onions added into our hot oil. I mentioned this in my update if you saw that, but if you didn't, I've had a very large life change, a move across the country. So adjusting to the new space and how we'll do videos like this in it, but I do have this beautiful gas range, which I've been very excited to cook on. So we'll see how we want to kind of set things up here as we look at other cooking videos. Alright, I'm just going to get those onions cooking, and I want to add some salt. I want to make sure we have some seasoning on this component of the dish. Don't need to cook these super intensely, just kind of get them softened up, sweetened up a little bit, and then we'll add the meat to our cauldron here. So yeah, in the original recipe, we go with a pretty thick depth of beef suet. I actually got a pretty heavy pour of oil here. I know I'm mentioning that the recipe calls for a lot, but I wasn't going to do quite so much. But here we are. The final dish, potentially if it ends up a little more fat in it than you would hope for, especially the way we're preparing the meat here, you can always chill it and skim anything that'll kind of rise and solidify on the top. You could skim that off. But overall, we're trying to stick to how Miles Davis did it. Just cooking these onions down. And when those are ready, then we're going to add in that beef that we prepared with the seasonings. As we go along, we have the initial seasoning, but we'll taste and we'll add more if we want. Like I said, I'll stick to the recipe, but the spices you have, the ingredients you're using, that can all vary. So always want to taste and adjust to where you want it to be in terms of flavor. We have the recipe to start with, but we'll be improvising a bit if we need. Find what works for you. And keep with that spirit of jazz, as would be appropriate if we're going to make Miles Davis chili mac. Not a lot of active steps to the recipe. I kind of couldn't resist playing with the onions, doing a stir fry vibe there, but you don't have to move around a ton. And I think those are getting to a pretty good place. They've softened up, getting translucent, and we should be about ready to add our ground beef and ground pork, or as Miles did it, be ground beef, ground pork, and ground veal. Alright, so let's get our meat seared here. Break it up into smaller pieces, using fairly high heat here to try to give ourselves as much help as we can to get some caramelization on the beef. That's going to add some extra flavor. Breaking things up as we cook things down here. We just kind of want to get this meat browned up. It's still going to cook for a long time in the beef broth. so we'll have plenty chance to cook it all the way through. Just an initial searing stage. Now, the way we're doing this, it is a lot of meat in this pot. We had water coming out of the onions, so we do have a decent amount of liquid. And if you have a lot of liquid like that, you're not really going to get searing, you're going to get boiling. So, not a big deal. If you get that initial sear, you're going to get that flavor, and it's okay if you don't. But ideally, you get a good sear, and you just get those little extra bits of flavor from having some of that browning on the meat. As I said, we're kind of sticking to the recipe here. If I was going to do this again, I would do it differently. The way I would approach this would be to cook the onions. I would take those out of the pot, and then I would sear the meat in a couple smaller batches. That way I have more control. There would be less liquid. We're more likely to get a nice good sear and browning on our meats without having a bunch of liquid in there. But doing the recipe as indicated, but that would be my suggestion if you kind of wanted to perfect each little component here. Not a big deal for me either way. The part of the beauty of this is just being able to throw a bunch of ingredients that you might have around into a pot and getting a really delicious and satisfying meal out of it. So let's not stress too much about the perfection. But, as always, things can be more and more refined with the more effort, energy, and technique that you put into them. Alright, so let's go ahead and add our kidney beans. We've browned up our meat, so we're just going to get the rest of our ingredients in here so this thing can stew away for a while. So we'll do the beans, just get those mixed in, and we will add our beef consommé or beef broth here. And what we're going to do is bring this up to a boil. Then we will lower the heat and let this simmer for about an hour or so as per the directions. Just get things incorporated, and we're going to let it do its thing. We'll basically be able to let it sit. We'll stir it occasionally. We have one other ingredient that we're going to add here. A little red wine vinegar. And this is to just help with a little bit of acidity in the dish. It's pretty rich. We've got that fat in there from the meats. Red wine vinegar will cut through a little bit, help balance it out. Now the recipe indicates 1 drop. That seems like not a noticeable amount to me, and I'm interpreting it as a splash. Used my spoon there to just get a little bit in here. This is one of those things that we will taste for, and we may add more if we want to get a bit more brightness against the richness in the dish. You can think of it like salt as being kind of an enhancer of other flavors more than being its own individual flavor here. And we'll add more salt and pepper as needed as well. And of course, our other spices like chili powder, cumin, and the garlic powder. Not a ton of spice for this amount of dish, so we might want to add a little bit more if we want a bit more flavor. And so I'm going to turn that down so it'll just simmer away here for about the next hour. It's already smelling amazing. if you've made tacos at home with like taco seasoning mix, it smells like that. Why? Because that contains chili powder, cumin, salt. And while this is cooking, I'm going to get that pasta started. Got a pot of water. Bring to a boil while the chili mac is simmering away. Just gonna get the water started for the pasta so we can cook up our spaghetti. Let's go ahead and get our burner on and we'll get that water heating. Now, of course, the chili mac, as the name implies, generally made with macaroni. The Miles Davis recipe specifically states spaghetti, so we're going to go that route. But of course, you could do it with the macaroni, as would be traditional for a quote-unquote chili mac. And with our water boiling, let's go ahead and get our pasta added into there. Some nice salted boiling water to cook that pasta. Give a little stir here on our big pot of chili. Use my tongs here to get the pasta fully immersed in its hot water bath. Alright, and that's going to cook for 9 minutes. Alright, let's have a little taste just to see how we're doing with the chili so far. It's been simmering half an hour or so probably. It's very good. I was worried there wouldn't be enough flavor with that volume of spice, but it actually tastes really good. I think we could probably add a little bit more of the chili and maybe cumin and garlic, but I think there could definitely be more of a chili note here. So as this cooks down, I'm going to kind of keep an eye on that. I suspect I'm going to add just a little bit more. And one thing you can do, this is not part of the recipe, but I've done this when making chili mac before. If it's spicy, you could add just a tiny bit of honey. It kind of helps smooth things out with that little bit of sweetness. Obviously, you know, sweet and heat are happy partners in the flavor arena. So that's something that you could riff on here if you wanted to, but I don't think we're going to need to, and we'll stick to the recipe, but it is something I've done with this type of recipe before. I do want to add a little bit more of that vinegar, however, just to help give a little bit more acid to this. So definitely not prominent, but just cut through a little bit. Alright, and we will let that simmer and keep going with the cook on the pasta. Alright, so we'll let that simmer, and I think our pasta is ready, so let's drain that so it'll be ready for serving. Okay, things are looking pretty good here. Off camera, I did add a touch more chili powder, and then let that simmer a bit. It can be a bit raw, so you want to give it time to kind of cook in the sauce to make sure that flavor is incorporated. So we'll start our plating with some of that spaghetti. Let's get a nice big helping of our chili mac going here. Alright, it's a nice chili inflected meaty sauce. It's got those beans in there. Very excited to dig into this. Now, he tops it with Parmesan cheese, and I actually did a bit of research trying to find if he would use Parmesan from the green can or more like fresh grated Parmesan. Green can, I feel like, was ubiquitous. It's been around since the 30s. But it does seem like markets of the time would likely have a wedge of Parmesan cheese, particularly places like Chicago or New York, places he might frequent that had large Italian populations. But I did note that he said grate Parmesan over, so I do think his intention was that you grate a block of Parmesan, so that is what we're going to do here, and that's going to taste better anyway. And then we need some crunch, so the other component in the recipe, oyster crackers, classic, just help add a bit of crunch to our sauce, so we don't just have kind of one texture in our dish here. All right, this is looking good. And then the suggested serving was with Heineken. So I have a Heineken here that we can pair with the Miles Davis Southside Chicago Chili Mack. All right, let's dig in and give it a try. I'll try to somehow get spaghetti noodles into my face on camera. All right, we're just gonna go for it. All right, that is really delicious. It's one of those things that you can just absolutely go to town on. There's a nice bit of chili heat there, flavor. Let's try some Heineken just to get the flavor pairing. Perfect. Really yummy, fun to try making this historical recipe from jazz great Miles Davis. Super easy to do and flavorful. Please enjoy.